Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we're uncovering how work is transforming one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen. With me today is Alexia Cambon, Head of Research for Copilot and the Future of Work at Microsoft. And she's bringing us a gift, brand new research from Microsoft based on trillions of productivity signals, emails, chats, meetings, app use across Microsoft 365. What this Work Trend Index Special Report reveals is something many of us are feeling already for quite a long time, that the workday has become infinite. Alexia, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So I was going to start with a different question, but your title. So I want to know what a Future of Work owner at Microsoft does.
Yeah, great question. It's a pretty fun job. I like to think that we're in the business of predicting and shaping the future of work. I think that's our mandate. And obviously, you have to be humble as a futurist, and you have to understand that 95% of what futurists predict winds up being wrong. But I like to think we're a very data-driven, science-backed team that take all of the data we have available to us and make informed scenario-based guesses as to what we can expect to see in the future of work.
Yeah, I think that's actually very cool. And I was wondering, you see so much data in this data that we're going to dive into in a minute, which is something that surprised even you.
The sheer volume of disruption and the stacking of multiple inputs in multiple environments at all time. It kind of, I call it the everything everywhere all at once
It did feel like that way, right? I mean, I looked at your data. So we should probably, dive right in, because I think, first of all, there's a validation there, right? We're all feeling this always on, always connected, always working kind of vibe. And you validate that, right? The workday starts, people are on email before 6 a.m. They're on email after 10 p.m. They're on email or other apps on weekends. What's going on?
Yeah, that was the question we asked ourselves. I think, it's a special report. It's following up from our annual Work Trend Index report that we released in April. And we just didn't have enough space in that report to really dive deep into these amazing insights around the workday and how it essentially has evolved past our capacity to handle it. And I think that has everything to do with the environment and less to do with the human. Humans are just not built to function in an environment where we're facing these high levels of disruption. And so what we set out to do was to really chart, what does the workday look like? We kind of have a sense of what it feels like from our survey data, but if we take the most objective data available to us, which is, of course, our telemetry signals, what are we seeing? And we had a bunch of hypotheses going in. And a lot of them were tied to personal experiences that everyone on my team have had. And that's some of the best way to do this work, is to say, well, I really have a sense that we're operating in a last minute culture, for example. Is there a way that we can validate that? And so one of my favorite data points in this report is based on an experience I had of running into work. I run commute to work, and I was running in at some ungodly hour for a 7 a.m. call. And I got to work and it got cancelled last minute. And I was very frustrated, very annoyed. So, I said to my team, let's go investigate the last minute culture. And what we looked at specifically was in the 10 minutes before the meeting, what is happening in the PowerPoint deck compared to the 3 hours before in the same deck. And what we saw was this incredible 122% boost of frantic editing happening, which really suggests that this last minute culture is a thing. We don't have enough focus time. We don't have time to really gather our thoughts and prepare. Everything feels like a scramble and a hurry. And so that's just one example of how we got the privilege of doing this type of investigation. So
that's, you kind of jumped in. The last minute culture is really interesting, but I think before we even go there, what jumped out at me first of all, right, was the always on, always connected. And I actually stopped myself for a second, and I was wondering whether it's a bad thing, because we kept talking about flexibility, right? And the whole idea of post-COVID, flexibility is that if you're a 6 a.m. person, it's fine for you to work at 6. If I'm a 10 p.m. person, it's fine for me to do my work at 10, right? So I think it's not as fine if we're doing both ends of the whole thing, right? But I asked myself, isn't the whole point of flexibility the fact that you see the interaction with people and work all over the place? And maybe if I'm doing my PowerPoint on a Saturday, maybe it just means that I went home at 4 p.m. because, I wanted to spend time with my kids.
You're absolutely right to point that out. And I think that is where the pairing of survey data with telemetry data becomes very powerful, because the telemetry data tells us what's happening and the survey data tells us how people are feeling. And we know from the annual report that 80% of global workers say they don't have enough time and energy to do their work. So whilst I would love to believe that we are making best use of the flexibility available to us, what the data is suggesting is that the blurring of those boundaries is leading to an infinite workday in which we just don't have the signals anymore to stop working. And maybe we need to start reinserting some of those boundaries for ourselves into the workday.
I think that's a really good question. And it got me thinking, because your other piece of data, it's not just the hours people work, right? It's the pace of how we communicate. So we used to complain about email overload, right? And I remember training about not using reply all on emails, right? Now we do emails, but then we start doing chats on all sorts of platforms, right? And chats are associated with an immediate response type of interaction, right? So something comes in, I'm expected to respond, not, even faster than email. So it almost felt like the communication was speeding up.
Totally. You are right to point out the differences in expectations we have for these types of communications. And Teams chats feel much more immediate and urgent. And we're receiving on average 153, I think it is, chats per day. And for some segments, that will probably be higher, right? This is the average.
Wow.
And
that's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. And after 5 p.m., there's still a high number. I think it's still something like 58 chats on average that you're receiving after 5 p.m. So it doesn't end at 5 p.m. Your Teams chats don't magically stop. And one of the statistics that to me was really galling was what that amounts to is that you are being interrupted on average every 2 minutes. And that's just within the M365 suite, right? We're not taking into account if you have WhatsApp open or if you have Spotify open or anything in browser. And I kept thinking about, what if you were to try to explain today's workday to someone in the 1950s? And the way you would explain it would be to say, oh, no, someone comes into your office every 2 minutes to ask you a question, right? That just did not exist.
Yeah, barges in and you can't close the door. Well, maybe we can, but we haven't learned to close the door.
Yeah, we feel...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we feel an expectation to be available and we don't have the physical restraint, the door, if you will, to block that out.
Which kind of leads me to what this does to focus time. And you're talking about that, right? Because I know it needs to be personalized by person, but we have different hours that are we focus and others that we don't focus as much. And if between 9 to 11 or, I don't know if it's 1 to 3 or 3 to 5, whatever hours, you're most focused. If you've got meetings going in, chats coming in, email coming in, and people walking into your, office or cubicle, if you're physically in at work, or if you're at home, your kids, coming into the area that you're working of, we don't have focus time, do we?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think the question of what is a meeting for becomes really important, because as you point out in the report, we see that where the bulk of meetings happen is where peak brain activity is. So those hours, of 11 a.m., of 1 to 3 p.m., those are hours in which our brains are switched on and they're ready to work. And we're spending them mostly in meetings. And the question becomes, if the meeting is high value and it's allowing us to do a lot of work, or it's meeting certain key outcomes, then maybe that is okay, right? Maybe in that sense, it is its own type of focus work. But my hypothesis is, and what some of the survey data we looked at a couple of years ago, is that meetings today are primarily about information exchange. It's all about getting people caught up. And that is literally because we have information flying everywhere all of the time. And as a result, I think we are not using meetings to their best purpose and using that peak brain activity time to its best purpose either.
So meetings were a problem for a long time. That they were a problem before COVID. They were a problem before we went digital, right? So this idea that many leaders call in meetings to get updates versus other ways of getting updates, I think that's been around forever. I think what actually was really interesting for me when I looked at your data is that something happened to the meetings, though, because they used to be bound by the physical, number of people you could cram into a conference room, and now that we're having them digital, there's like, instead of like the emails with a reply all, there's an invite all kind of meeting going on.
Yeah, I think that has everything to do with that it costs so little now to communicate and to exchange information. And one of the practices that I try to put in place on my team and with myself is, before I send any email or before I invite anyone to a meeting, I ask, if this email cost me $50 to send, would I send it? Because it is a cost on the recipient's energy and cognitive load to consume and process that email. And it is very assumptive of you that is something they should spend that cognitive load on. And I think the same is true of meetings. I do think people probably are feeling more empowered to say no to meetings now that we have AI that enables us to catch up on meetings more readily. That you're not going to miss out on critical information because the recap will be there. But certainly for emails, you have no control over whether or not someone sends you an email. And that we see.
Do you know if I was just invited to a meeting or actually attended it?
In terms of
your data, I think you do, because you actually have somewhere on there that like almost 60% of the meetings were ad hoc with no calendar invites.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
They were people deciding to meet on something. And I think you also said that 1 in 10 scheduled meetings were booked last minute. So they weren't even, it was the fastest growing mode of working. So we're not just communicating through chats that are kind of ad hoc. We're meeting ad hoc. And I was asking myself, is that a problem? Because maybe the solution to these big update meetings that, people are reading email when somebody's talking, is that we're meeting when we need to in real time. Like we popped our head into somebody's office and asked a question.
That's my hope. I mean, I think the ad hoc nature of work can be either super disruptive or it can be super productive, depending on which way you view it. And that's half of the battle with looking at this research, is learning how to interpret it. My worst nightmare is getting an unexpected phone call. I hate it when people phone me out of the blue. It makes me really socially anxious. But I also know, again, like we are feeling more and more empowered to turn down meetings because we know we can get the recap through AI. So there is maybe a sense of now reaching people ad hoc is more desirable because you're just going to phone someone up with a question rather than schedule a formal meeting. But yeah, it's all. I think it's a very personal question, which I think all work trends are. It is absolutely in the eye of the beholder, and whether or not we see a rise in ad hoc meetings is a good or a bad thing, I think the answer to that will very much depend on you, the person looking at that data.
And maybe that's where the solution lies. So I'm thinking, your example about coaching your team that sending an email or calling a meeting is like spending money on something. And, what if they had to pay, right? What if you had a conversation with me as maybe somebody on your team saying, please do not call me, check with me first if to call me, right? And so it's that. I actually remember a new manager I had once, and their first interaction on a one-on-one basis was, here's how I like to work. How do you like to work? Not even on a team basis, because he wanted to align work styles, right? And I thought it was fabulous.
I think that was what hybrid and remote work during the pandemic did really well, is it forced us to have those conversations. And I similarly remember building out a hybrid playbook, really wanting to know, how does my team work best, because I can only reach them virtually now. And all of a sudden, I don't know if they prefer to be reached via Teams, if they prefer to be reached via email or via a meeting. And that's probably something as a manager I should know. So yeah, I do think I would like us to have that same discipline we had back when we were being hyper intentional, because we were operating in a 100% remote environment, which we'd never had to do before. I think we need to carry that intentionality over into today's workday.
Yeah, and I think you actually have that 3-peak workday, which I think during the pandemic showed up, and we didn't know if it would stick around, right? And this idea that, you want to describe it for a second?
Yeah. Triple peak has not peaked.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is essentially we used to have 2 peaks in the day where we would see sort of intense spurts of work. And now we're seeing a third peak, which is, of course, in the evening. So before it was, right before lunch and right after lunch. And now we're seeing more and more people do work in the evenings. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? If you can, spend your 3 to 5 p.m. going to pick up your kids and spending time with them, and then, refunneling that time into work in the evening, and that's better for your pace, that's better for your work style, great. I think then the triple peak makes sense and is okay. I think what we don't want, obviously, is that it's just a more unsustainable amount of work that's being done, but just distributed across the entire workday.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is up to us, and goes back to that alignment that during COVID we did. I think when we started shifting to a kind of more structured hybrid, we did. Maybe it's time to do it again, because I wouldn't want anybody to tell me don't work on those hours. I know we have these conversations. Should you schedule a 6 a.m. or a 10 p.m. Email versus send it out? And my response is no, please don't, because if I'm working 10 p.m. and you're a 6 a.m. person and I schedule it for 8, you missed the email, right? So I'd much rather say, I do not expect you to respond at 10 p.m. If you want to respond at 6 a.m., I don't need to read it, right? That's contract that we need to learn how to do, versus try to bring us back into this structure.
Yeah, I love what you're saying here about this idea of the social contract, which is we need to be as inclusive as possible of as many work styles as possible. And the way to do that is probably not to create a box of this is how work should get done, but instead to trust people to establish working patterns, and then in turn to trust them to try to make those working patterns work with everyone else's. And the best way to do that is, to your example, communicate transparently. This is how I work best. That doesn't mean I expect you to work in that way. I do think some people need and prefer much stricter boundaries. I have friends who want to go into the office every day because they want work to happen at the office. They don't want to bring work home with them. And friends who want work to be in that strict time restriction of 9 to 5. They do not want to work in the evenings. And I think that's fine. If the boundaries is what they prefer, I think that's great. I'm the type of person who cannot switch off work. I am thinking about work all the time. I'm thinking about it, when I'm grocery shopping. I'm thinking about it when I'm running in particular. It's just not a switch I can flick off. So for me, that flexibility is incredibly needed if I'm to maintain my sanity.
Yeah, no, I agree. I wonder, okay, let's bring AI into the mix. I was wondering, is this going to make this better or worse?
Well, that is a question we asked ourselves. I think we wanted to hold ourselves accountable to investigating that, because it is a new technology. It's a new input. It's a new channel. One of the ways in which we investigated this is actually in the annual report, where we looked at our 31,000 person survey and we tried to identify respondents in that survey who could be working for what we call frontier firms. And these are firms that have broad AI scale deployment, AI maturity. They're using agents. They're seeing ROI from those agents. So basically a very advanced, mature AI company. Of the 31,000, only about 840 qualified as frontier firm employees. So a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. When we looked at their outcomes compared to everyone else's, the differences were pretty galling. And they were all statistically significant. This wasn't random. So they were much more likely to say they could take on more work, much more likely to say their company was thriving, much more likely to say they found meaning and purpose in their work, that they were optimistic about the future of work. And all of these outcomes suggest to us that they are not experiencing the same type of unsustainable workday or work environment that the rest of the population are. And so that gave me some hope that for those companies where they have cracked the AI nut, if you will, the outcomes are better and AI is not making things worse.
Do we know what they're doing?
In terms of using AI?
For example, contracting or some of the structure that we just talked about, the rest of us are all missing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially the way work happens today, it's very focused on coordination taxes and consumption taxes that we're all paying because we have so much information that is wading around everywhere. And as a result, we spend a huge amount of our limited cognitive capacity sorting through and analyzing and consuming that information. And I think what these frontier firms are doing on a Workday level that is very interesting is that they've understood that we're moving from this sort of era of information to an era of intelligence where our workers shouldn't be paying a consumption tax. That consumption tax should be paid by AI, should be paid by agents. They're the ones that should be consuming all of this information and reporting back to us the key things we need to know. So I think a whole lot of that coordination and consumption tax goes away. And that is one of my hypotheses as to why the Workday is much more sustainable for the frontier firm employee, because they have found a way of creating a Workday that does not involve checking your email at 6 a.m. or reading 117 emails or reading 158 chats. A whole lot of that consumption burden lands on AI.
Okay, then we should hope that in the next year or so, we'll see a larger percentage of all of us enjoying that. Until then, I'm wondering, when you looked at all that and asked yourself how that, at the personal level, because that's what I did, right? I looked at that and I said, okay, sounds familiar. Don't like it. What can I do, right? What are the things that I can do? And I was reminded actually I'm sorry, I'm aging myself here. I got my first laptop, right? And suddenly you could work outside of work. And I think for a while, I wasn't allowed to, so I'm going to apologize. But I learned that I had to keep it at the trunk of my car when I came home. Otherwise, it was in the middle of the living room on the table, and I used it all the time, and there was no time for anything else, right? So you can't do that today anymore because it's just how it is, right? But what are the things that maybe you looked at this and you said, okay, here's something I'm going to do differently?
Yeah, great question. I am a big fan of artificial boundaries. So I know during the pandemic, I had friends who would go for a drive around their house. That was their commute time, right? I have friends who put on, a suit and proper work attire to get the brain signal of we're at work now. I think anywhere we can reintegrate some boundaries that we hold ourselves accountable to is a mature, elegant thing to do. For me personally, I have one key ritual that I never violate. And if I do, I really feel a lot of guilt towards myself, and that is my daily run. And I swear to you, it is genuinely been a process to get to the point where I don't feel guilty about turning down a meeting to protect my daily run, because I see that daily run as not just inherent to my mental health, but inherent to how I get work done. Like, that is the place where I have my focus time, where I problem solve, where I very much think creatively. And if I don't get that daily run, then that's not going to happen. So I think finding how you can insert periods of time in your day to really create the space for focus work, for time to yourself without guilt, to me, that's a key step we all should be undertaking. And then I'll say the AI of it all, because obviously that's sort of inherent in that question as well. AI is creating some amazing new opportunities to work differently. And I really want us to try and embrace those. And I can think of two examples I'll share with you. The first that's related to meetings and the other that's related to focus time. The meetings one is, there is a way of doing meetings now that does not just involve me getting on a call and telling you a bunch of stuff that you need to know. And that is essentially moving from meetings for information exchange and moving to meetings that are about value creation. And some of my favorite meetings now that I do with my team are all about getting on a call and creating out loud. And by that, I mean talking out loud about our most creative, exciting ideas with the goal really of making the meeting really high value so that then AI can go and take the transcription and create out of it. And that is a completely different paradigm, I think, for meetings, because you are aware that every word you say is going to be transcribed and could be used to create an artifact.
Yeah.
And so I think starting a meeting with that, which is what is the high value stuff that I can say so we can create amazing things, is really cool.
Yeah. And even the idea, since we're transcribing everything, right? You can transcribe it and use it like we did, which is meeting minutes distributed via something. Or you could say, I'm going to transcribe it and feed it some questions and see what comes up, right?
Yeah, totally. Query it, treat it like a living artifact. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I can share my own experience, right? I mean, I have these podcast conversations, and a lot of times I end up writing Forbes articles that are triggered by these conversations, right? But they're not the transcript of the conversation. They're basically, and I use the tools, right, to help me think through what I can do with this content, right? Or what kind of thought-provoking other questions or other angles you can take using it, which I think is fabulous.
100%. And I think that's one of the things I'm really excited about, which was my second example, is about not just the creation of content, but the consumption of content and how that will change. And as an example, I have someone on my team who I work very closely with. He's a brilliant economist, brilliant data scientist, and he often sends me the first draft of whatever paper it is that we're working on for me to read. And there was this one period of time when we were doing this research that I just could not read another draft. I just could not do it. I was so overwhelmed and so tired. And I kept putting it off week after week after week. And finally, one Friday morning, he sent me an email with a link to a podcast. He'd fed the draft of the paper and created a podcast out of it, and told me to go on my run and listen to it. And it just blew my mind away, because again, this is a net new thing, that a net new type of value that AI has provided us. Like my economist was never going to sit down and record a podcast about the paper, right? I wouldn't have wanted him to spend 30 minutes doing that. But he literally could generate that in 5 minutes for me to go then listen and consume on my run. And that was a completely different way of working. So I'm very excited when we think about these new types of AI generated ways of working that we can embrace.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I always end with this question for Benny. It's not something they're used to. I suspect that's not going to be the case for you. But I ask, what's the question you think we should all be asking ourselves these days about the future of work?
Wow, what a great question. For me, I think the biggest barrier for me right now that I see individuals, organizations tackle is really, how should we think about AI? Like, what is the mindset we need to have in place when we think about AI and what it is and what it does for us? And I think a lot of us are operating on an outdated model, and we're thinking that AI is just another type of software that we're going to roll out and it's going to provide us some productivity gains. And everything suggests that this behaves incredibly differently from any other kind of software we've known. And if we can update our mental model to think about it less as a tool and more as a new kind of team member or a thought partner or an additional type of intelligence, not a substitutional type, but an additional type of intelligence we can utilize, for example, in that way of the podcast, right? then I think we can start to restructure work in a way that is hopefully a lot more sustainable and a lot more enjoyable for humans.
And adapted for the different people, right? I think that's so thank you for that. I have to say that this report also got me thinking how much we need to educate ourselves about working in this new environment. So the speed, we can't slow it down, but we need to learn how to have those doors that, we can shut so that not everybody can come in at all times and ask a question, for example.
I think that's spot on. I think we have power to change our own lives, right? There's a lot that's outside of our control, but we do also have the power to make use of the tools in the way that we feel fits us best. That's not to negate that the work environment isn't a huge influence on us and isn't outside of our control in many ways. But also there are steps we can take to reclaim some of that power.
Yeah, and it's the only thing we can control. Thank you, Alexia, for joining me today. For more about Alexia and the Work Trend Index Special Report, check out the links in the podcast description. Thank you for joining the Future of Less Work. And remember, the new social contract is a win-win between people and organizations. Your best people do not work because they have to, nor because you measure them on it, nor because you tell them to. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're achieving what's important for them in life. Till next time.